Bob Herbert's oped.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to oped.tv. I've seen a lot in my long career in journalism, but nothing remotely like the Donald J. Trump administration. It's a whirlwind. It's chaotic. Long-standing norms have been upended. And there's a palpable fear among many voters that what is happening is, at least in some ways, very dangerous. We'll talk about this with my guest, Nicholas Lemann, a distinguished journalist and historian and a former dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. He is a staff writer for The New Yorker, and his work has appeared in many other publications. Nick, welcome. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it. The first question is sort of a two-pronged question. Is there an upside, in some sense, to the Trump presidency? And the second part is, what about what you've seen so far concerns you the most?
Let me do the second part first while I think about the first part.
Okay.
The thing that is most concerning is the sense you get that President Trump doesn't 100% believe in the rule of law. Well, I'll give you a small list of things. Mm-hmm. That's one, that he ran on deep mistrust and hostility to the system, and therefore at least I'm not sold on the idea that he believes that you have to play by the rules of the American constitutional system. I find that frightening. Second would be there's so much argument about presidents, and so many people so much don't like them, that we forget that it's been a while since we have had a president who basically insults people individually and as members of categories. Most of our presidents, including both Democrats and Republicans, have tried very hard not to demonize anybody. And that's what Trump does all day.
That's his modus operandi.
Yeah, and it changes the nature of the office, and it feels a little dangerous, like it can unleash things that are sort of kept at bay in the American consciousness. And then the third thing I'd say is he doesn't seem to seek information in a disciplined way, and he doesn't seem to have a process by which he decides what he thinks about things based on knowing at least something. Everything seems to be instant, and everything is based on instinct. And, you shouldn't always trust your instincts.
Right.
So if there's an upside, which I don't know if there is, well, let me put it this way. We had a moment kind of in the second half of the 1990s when it seemed as if there was a consensus about all the major issues in the world. The Cold War was over. A lot of Americans on the left and on the right thought that the world had accepted American leadership very gratefully. Markets were working, etc. There was a feeling that all the major problems had been solved. And that obviously is not true, because since then we've had 9/11, the financial crisis, and a bunch of other stuff, the war in Iraq. But the two major political parties have, in some ways, have not gotten themselves out of that moment all the way. Mm-hmm. And I think one reason Trump happened is the parties were not good at addressing, what's on the minds of at least a lot of Americans. And this might be a wake-up call to one party, the other party, or both parties, not to be quite so complacent about the kind of language they use and just their general take on things.
You mentioned Trump's tendency to demonize individuals or groups, and what I've been noticing more than I've ever seen before is how many ordinary people, not people associated with journalism or media writ large, are really frightened and personally frightened or frightened for their families. I mean, they think that something may come that would be harmful to them as a result of the Trump presidency. I mean, and these are, and sometimes Muslims, sometimes Latinos, sometimes African Americans, but an array of group, a lot of women. And whatever his view is or approach is to this, that is a bad thing in a country and in the United States of America. Shouldn't he address this? And if he were to address it, what is something that he could or should do to alleviate some of these fears?
I think it's almost impossible. He should, but he won't. And it's just impossible to imagine him doing that. I think that, all that kind of bring us together rhetoric that we're used to hearing from presidents,
right,
and that you're used to hearing it so much you think it's a little dull. You've never heard it from Trump, including in his inauguration address, where it's almost the rule. He talks about, things are terrible, we have enemies everywhere, and he just is not, it's not in his head or his heart to reassure or to use any kind of unity rhetoric or to try to bring us together. And I don't really think he gets at a deep level how this plays out. I mean, I see it, I think as a guess, Trump and sort of people in his circle have this idea of, quote, political correctness being pervasive everywhere and not being about anything real, that there's this sort of hypersensitivity in American culture, and that, you can, quote, tell it like it is, and it'll clear the air and there won't be any negative consequence. But, I see it with my students at Columbia, many or even most of whom are non-US, and who are out kind of walking on the streets all day long, have visas. I see it in my kids' schools, and I'm being anecdotal, but I get a lot of personal feedback like this from people I know.
Right.
And it's scary. But I don't think Trump sees that at all.
You mentioned the approach of the two parties over the past several years. The Republican Party for a long time has sort of stoked working class anger in this country for a great deal of political gain, but while not doing anything to improve sort of the lives of working people. The Democratic Party, which used to be the party of working people, has not done a lot either to lessen inequality, has not done anything to lessen inequality, and has not done a great deal to address the concerns of ordinary working Americans or the poor. So talk a little bit, you started to talk about it, talk a little bit about how the behavior of the two parties led us to this moment in American history.
I'm writing a book right now, and the part of the book I'm writing right now is about the early days of the New Deal. So let's use that as a baseline. Okay. So in the 1930s, the country was, there were these big regional splits because the South, the most conservative region of the country, was still the most democratic region of the country because of the Civil War and Reconstruction. But other than that, everybody essentially below the median income was a Democrat, and almost everybody above the median income was a Republican. It was very simple. One was the party of labor, one was the party of business. And then, over the years, things got complicated. In 2016, although labor was mainly on the side of the Democratic Party, it has shrunk a lot. And Hillary Clinton was pulling, in the financial sense, huge majority of money from Wall Street, Silicon Valley, corporate America compared to Trump. So to say in this election the Republicans were the party of business would not be accurate.
Right.
So everything's gotten a little bit scrambled here, where the Democrats in the sort of Clinton to Obama to another Clinton run became a much more ideologically centrist party and had this so-called coalition of the ascendant, that is, the people with higher education degrees plus minorities who tended to be doing better than their parents.
Right.
And that was thought to be enough, but it led to a sort of complex set of positions that wasn't the old-fashioned, we're the party of labor. The opening that Trump found to go into was that both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, there's this big group of Americans who are predominantly but not exclusively white, very heavily not people living on the coasts. We talk about inequality. We have inequality of income, we have inequality of wealth, we also have growing inequality of geography.
Right.
Where Trump carried something like 3/4 of the counties in America. So there's a large group of people, predominantly white, predominantly without a college degree, predominantly not living on the coasts, who feel like they've been left behind in the new economy and no one cares about them.
Right.
No one speaks to their concerns. And Trump, I think the reason he was elected president is he was able to get up and say, I'm all about you.
Yep.
Now, he didn't appeal to these folks' better impulses, but
To say the least.
but he did send a very strong message. Finally, there's a politician who understands you, who sees the world the way you see it, who perceives American life over this last generation as a giant disaster that no one wants to talk about. And that's very, very powerful. I think the elites of the parties are not cynical people. I think people came around, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, to the idea that markets really are great things and they really are good for all people, that regulation is almost always bad, that unions often stand out in the way of progress. All those kinds of thoughts are deeply embedded in the liberal elite culture as well as the conservative elite culture. And somebody like the Clintons, Obama, as well as the leading Republican candidates, they tend to live on the coasts, live inside a world of like-minded, very highly educated people at the very best colleges and universities. The people they meet think the same way.
Right.
And it's hard to connect or to feel your way into this other part of the country that
They're
that
not
feels
among the people, the men and women, the families who are struggling.
Right.
This is ironic because you wrote that yet another tragic consequence of the 2008 financial crisis, which gave us the Great Recession, is it has brought to power the politician most likely to create the next one. Explain what you meant by that.
Well, I think the fundamental reason for the financial crisis is deregulation. We mentioned I'm writing a book where I'm going to go into some detail about this, but with apologies for oversimplifying, the American financial system, since it became mature after the Civil War, went through a series of periodic crises and meltdowns. When Roosevelt came to office, it was very heavily regulated, and then went through almost 50 years of essentially no financial crises.
Right.
Not to say no economic recessions, but no crises in the financial system. And then everybody felt safe, and we started deregulating. We deregulated the savings and loans. They went bust. We learned our lesson for a couple of years, and then we deregulated the banks. We deregulated derivatives. We got rid of Glass-Steagall. We started allowing banks to take on more debt, take on more risk, and the result was the financial crisis.
Now, these were intelligent folks who
Yeah.
were in charge of government and the economy in those years. Why is it that lessons weren't properly learned?
Well, just as an anecdote, this was told to me by Bob Reich, who was the labor secretary under Clinton, was
Sure.
sort of the dissenter on all these Clinton economic policies.
And was not listened to.
Yeah, and he told me that after the financial crisis, he ran into Bob Rubin, Treasury Secretary under Clinton, who was the main architect
Right.
of all these policies, and a perfectly nice man. And he said to him, Bob, what happened? And he said, Rubin looked him in the eye and said, "This is like one of those 1,000-year floods. It's a collection of events happening at the same time that are so fantastically unlikely that they could never possibly happen again, even if there were no, corrective measures taken." That's how unusual it
Right.
was. So, what the government did, the main response to the financial crisis, among other things, was Dodd-Frank. And Trump just gets up every day now and says Dodd-Frank's
Exactly.
got to go.
It's gotta go.
Can't wait to demolish Dodd-Frank, et cetera. So, the system is much more regulated than it was before the crash. Trump and the people around him have, they're not doing all this stuff in secret. They have got up and said repeatedly, we're going to undo all these new post-crash regulations. And I think there's a very high risk that the result will be another financial crisis.
Right. One of the things that concerns so many people is the sort of authoritarian tendencies of Trump and the administration. And I was thinking, you were mentioning the Roosevelt era, and I was thinking, are we, in terms of the population as a whole, so far removed from the Great Depression and the period leading up to World War II and then the war itself, fascism overseas and that sort of thing? Are we so far removed that people don't have a visceral understanding of the horrors of that era and just assume that this can't happen again?
Democracy and democratic values and civil liberties are not a given. People
Right.
may think they are, but they're not.
They're not.
And if you
In
just
fact,
take
they're very fragile.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you take a trot around the world, you find Trump here. You find China as the clear rising power in the world, just dissenting from the idea that everybody has to be a democracy. Russia, despite the hopes people had after the Soviet Union broke apart, not being less and less democratic. India is becoming less democratic. Turkey's becoming less democratic. Egypt has become less democratic after a brief flowering. And then you have these far-right parties all over Europe that are on the rise. So, there's a trend here. And I think people should not assume it can't happen here.
Right.
And I think in a lot of these cases, it's people reacting to economic discontent.
Right.
Because I would like to say Franklin Roosevelt was reacting to economic discontent, and he found a way to do it by appealing to people's better selves. But these discontents are deep, and you can also react to them by appealing to people's worse selves.
Mm-hmm.
So there's both kinds. But I think to pick on a former colleague of both of ours, Tom Friedman, there's this idea at the height of the 90s and early aughts that basically you were going to have, Tom wrote a book called The Alexis and the Olive Tree.
I remember.
And basically his argument was, look, there's this wonderful party going on in the world led by the United States. It's going to be good for everybody. Sure, a few people won't like it, but that's like Osama bin Laden.
Right.
He just assumed, and he spoke for a broad consensus at the time, that most people in the world would realize how great this new form of capitalism that was globalized, deregulated, and financialized would be for them, and it would deliver for them, and that would be the driving force in the world. it turns out that the benefits of this kind of capitalism are very, very unequally distributed.
And a lot of people get left out,
Yeah,
not just a few.
Yeah, and it causes enormous discontent that politicians are tapping into in various ways. That seems to me to be the big political event of the last 10 years, and I don't think it's going away.
I agree. And speaking of this economic discontent, I think one of the reasons that so many people have missed the boat, one of many, and not the largest by any means, but I think that the press, journalists have really not told the story of inequality and the struggles of working people very well. They have hardly covered the poor here in the United States. And one of the things that I always thought was strange about that was, or two aspects of it, these are very important issues, but also when you get on the ground and cover them, they're very compelling stories. And it reminds me of your great book of several years ago, The Promised Land, which told the story of the black migration from the South to the North, a story that it was an enormous story and had been almost wholly missed, both by journalists and historians. Why do you think there is a reluctance to dive into these stories?
Well, there's a number of reasons why. Number one, journalists are better at covering events and personalities than they are at covering sort of trends and underlying realities that don't present themselves in dramatic form. To the extent Trump, as we were discussing, is about all these things, that's the story. But if inequality is rising or poverty is stuck, it's not an obvious way to get at that story. And, within the culture of newsrooms, which are very economically challenged these days, whatever resources used to be devoted to all this are decreased. I have a friend Tim Noah, who works at Politico, who claims to be the last full-time labor reporter who's a full-time employee in the whole country. Mm-hmm. Everybody used to have a labor reporter.
It was ubiquitous. Every publication had a labor reporter.
Yeah. So that's all really changed. And then another thing, for whatever reason, good or bad, so-called social issues or identity issues are just much more top of mind for the liberal press than economic issues. So you see, an example the other day, the Times had a story, a positive story about the controversial Betsy DeVos, who's been nominated to be Secretary of Education. And, the story was essentially, she privately has been very tolerant and even encouraging toward gay marriage. Well, and I'm sure that's true, and more power to her, but there was this idea that, all is forgiven if you're for gay marriage. In other words, if you believe essentially the U.S. shouldn't have a public education system, but you're for gay marriage.
So leave this enormous issue off the table and focus on this one important issue, but it's just one aspect.
Right. So kind of institutional life, economic life, things like that just aren't in the power position in the liberal mind on the East Coast at this moment, and that's part of the explanation of what the press is covering.
I wish we had more time. Nick Lemann, this has been really terrific. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Americans are going to have to decide what kind of country we want. Right now, we're a country led by a man whose view of America is a society fearfully huddled behind walls and other barriers, retreating from the kind of engagement and international cooperation that allows people to thrive in an increasingly globalized world. He is a man who has placed the highest ideals of America in cold storage, who admires not the champions of freedom and democracy who have done so much to make America great, but the policies and behavior of bullies and authoritarians from other societies whose collective values can best be summed up as shameful. This is not an America that I've seen before. and it breaks my heart to see it now. We're led by a man who views people who don't look like him as lesser beings, as the hated and dangerous other, unworthy of compassion or respect. That racial, ethnic, or religious other is always a handy scapegoat and an object of contempt. We've learned that we cannot trust what this leader or his minions say. They traffic in lies, large and small. We remember the lies about our former president, how he wasn't even an American, and thus epitomized the dangerous other and had no right to hold the office of the president. We recall the spokesperson who only recently explained that lies were not really lies, but something else, something not so harsh, alternative facts. We have a leader who never reads. He watches television and tweets. The nuclear codes are in his pocket or his briefcase, somewhere nearby, but he disdains his daily intelligence briefing, saying, "You know, I'm like a smart person. I don't have to be told the same thing in the same words every single day." Anyone who has studied history knows that many societies have fallen under the sway of leaders like this one. They've always ended badly. Is this what we want for America? I don't think so. I hope not. That's all for now. See you next time.